Before December 1941, before Pearl Harbor thrust America into World War II, a quiet revolution had already begun. Not on battlefields, not in military academies, but in the marble halls of the Treasury Department. The United States government had borrowed $90 million to run the entire country. 4 years later, that number had exploded to $2.8 billion. The war had been paid for with something invisible, something that wouldn't come due for generations. And in that transformation, warfare itself would change forever. This is the story you've never heard. Not about generals or battles, not about victories or defeats, but about the financial engineering that made modern war possible. Because here's what nobody talks about. Wars are supposed to hurt. They're supposed to be expensive, disruptive, politically toxic. The cost should make citizens think twice, make leaders hesitate, make societies carefully weigh whether the fight is truly worth the sacrifice. But somewhere along the line, that natural break disappeared. And when it did, war stopped being a last resort and became just another policy option. The question we're asking today cuts deeper than any history book will admit. How did nations learn to wage trillion-dollar conflicts while their citizens felt almost nothing? How did the most expensive endeavor in human civilization become so easy to start? And most importantly, who benefits when war becomes invisible to the people who pay for it? This isn't ancient history. This is happening right now, shaping conflicts from Ukraine to the Middle East, determining which wars get fought and which get avoided. And the mechanism behind it all, the financial innovation that changed everything, is so simple it's almost invisible. Governments discovered they could fight wars without asking permission. All they needed was a promise to pay later. All they needed was debt. The story begins in a very different era, when warfare had a price everyone could see. Throughout most of human history, funding a war was brutally simple. Kings needed gold, so they took it from their subjects through taxation. The connection was immediate and painful. Every sword, every cannon, every soldier's meal came directly from someone's pocket. And that created a natural resistance, a friction that made war politically dangerous. When Edward I wanted to fight Scotland in 1296, he had to face baronial revolts over war taxes. When Charles I tried to finance his conflicts without Parliament's consent in the 1620s, it helped trigger the English Civil War. The cost of war was visible, immediate, and politically explosive. But then something changed. In the late 17th century, the Bank of England pioneered a new concept. Instead of extracting resources directly from citizens through taxation, governments could borrow money from wealthy creditors and pay it back over time with interest. The War of Spanish Succession, fought from 1701 to 1714, marked one of the first major conflicts financed substantially through government borrowing. Britain accumulated massive debt. But the immediate political fallout was minimal compared to raising equivalent funds through taxation. The subjects didn't feel the pinch right away. They weren't rioting in the streets. The war could continue. This was the beginning of a fundamental shift. For centuries, political thinkers had understood that war required sacrifice, and sacrifice required consent. But debt severed that connection. It created distance between the decision to fight and the cost of fighting, and that distance would prove incredibly valuable to anyone looking to wage war without public resistance. By the time the American Civil War erupted in 1861, both sides immediately turned to borrowing rather than taxation. The Union's national debt exploded from $90 million to nearly $2.8 billion. The Confederacy tried desperately to sell bonds and print money rather than impose heavy taxes. Why? Because Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase and Confederate leaders understood a political reality that transcends time and place. Taxing citizens to fight a war creates immediate political pain. Every dollar taken is a dollar voters notice, a dollar they might protest, a dollar that forces them to ask whether the war is truly worth it. But borrowing is quiet. The bills come due in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, long after the politicians who started the war have left office. During the First World War, this strategy reached industrial scale. When the conflict began in 1914, Britain, France, and Germany all assumed it would last a few months, maybe a year at most. No one wanted to immediately impose crushing war taxes because they assumed victory would come quickly. So they borrowed and borrowed and borrowed some more. Germany conducted 9 separate war bond drives over the course of the conflict. Austria-Hungary sold bonds every 6 months, like clockwork. Britain borrowed not just from its own citizens but from the United States, accumulating debts that would take decades to repay. The political calculus was nakedly obvious. Borrowing reduced immediate resistance, it made war feel less costly to the average citizen, at least in the short term, and it transferred the financial burden to future governments, future taxpayers, future generations who had no say in the decision to fight. The politicians and generals who chose war would be long gone by the time the bills came due. The people who actually paid, through decades of interest and debt service, would be those who never voted for the conflict in the first place. This was the great betrayal. Debt hadn't made war cheaper. It had made war quieter. It had removed the natural political brake that forced societies to carefully consider whether a conflict was worth the sacrifice. And once leaders realized they could bypass public resistance, the temptation became irresistible. But something even more insidious was happening beneath the surface. Debt wasn't just changing how wars were funded, it was changing who benefited from them. When a government borrows money to fight a war, someone has to lend it that money. Banks, wealthy investors, financial institutions. And those lenders earn interest on every dollar they loan. The longer the war drags on, the more money the government has to borrow, the more interest accumulates. Suddenly, there's a class of people who profit directly from prolonged conflict. Not arms manufacturers, though they benefit too, not generals seeking glory, but bankers and bondholders whose wealth grows with every year the war continues and the debt mounts. During the American Civil War, financier Jay Cooke made a fortune selling Union war bonds to ordinary citizens through massive publicity campaigns. The Union sold government bonds worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and Cooke took his cut. After World War I, Britain found itself owing $4.5 billion to the United States. France owed $3.9 billion. These weren't just numbers on a ledger. They represented decades of future tax revenue that would flow from ordinary citizens to wealthy creditors. The Great War had created a new class of winners, not necessarily the victors on the battlefield, but the lenders who financed it. And this is where the story gets darker. Because once a society becomes dependent on debt to fight its wars, it becomes dependent on the people willing to lend. And those lenders gain enormous power over government policy. They can demand favorable terms, influence decisions, shape the very direction of conflicts. The line between financial interest and national interest begins to blur. During World War II, the United States government borrowed $230 billion, about 216% of the nation's annual economic output in 1940. Commercial banks absorbed 31% of that marketable debt. The Federal Reserve bought another 13%. But here's what's remarkable. Even as the government went trillions into debt to fight the Axis powers, private banks and wealthy Americans became extraordinarily rich. They owned government bonds that paid interest. They held securities backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. The war created wealth, but not for everyone. For those with capital to lend, World War II was an investment opportunity. Now you might argue that winning the war justified any cost, that defeating fascism was worth going into debt. And perhaps you're right. But here's the question we need to ask. If the war had been paid for entirely through taxes, would the public have been more careful about how it was fought? Would there have been more pressure to end it quickly, to minimize casualties, to avoid waste? Would the political system have had stronger incentives to seek peace? We'll never know, because by the time World War II ended, the model was set. Major wars would be fought on borrowed money. The costs would be deferred. Future generations would pay the interest. And the people who lent the money would profit handsomely while soldiers died on distant shores. But the real consequences were only beginning to unfold. When World War II ended, the United States didn't pay off its war debt. Why would it? The economy was booming. Growth was strong. And with growth came inflation, which quietly eroded the real value of that debt over time. Between 1946 and 1974, America's debt-to-GDP ratio fell from 106% to 23%. Politicians love to claim this proves you can grow your way out of debt. But recent research shows that's not what actually happened. Much of that debt reduction came from primary budget surpluses, meaning the government actually collected more in taxes than it spent. Another huge chunk came from surprise inflation, which reduced the real value of the debt. And a significant portion came from financial repression. policies that kept interest rates artificially low so the government could borrow cheaply. In other words, the debt was paid off, but not by the people who incurred it. It was paid off by future taxpayers, by citizens who saw their savings eroded through inflation, by workers whose purchasing power declined as prices rose faster than wages. The bills came due exactly where they always do, on ordinary people who had no say in the decision to fight. This pattern repeats throughout history. After wars, governments face a choice. They can raise taxes to pay down the debt, which is politically painful but honest. Or they can let inflation do the work, which is politically easier but amounts to a hidden tax on everyone who holds currency or saves money. Guess which option governments usually choose? During and after World War I, governments relied heavily on inflation to reduce their war debts. Prices and money supply both rose by nearly 50%, eroding the real value of what they owed, while simultaneously depressing investment and raising the cost of imported goods. The Weimar Republic took it to an extreme, printing money so aggressively that hyperinflation destroyed the German economy by 1923. A loaf of bread that cost a quarter mark in 1918 cost 200 billion marks by late 1923. The government had eliminated its debt, but it had also wiped out the savings of an entire middle class. The economic chaos helped pave the way for political extremism and eventually World War II. But here's the truly disturbing part. This wasn't an accident. This was the system working as designed. War debt creates a trap. Governments borrow to avoid immediate political resistance. They promise to pay it back later. But when later arrives, they face the same political problem. Raising taxes is unpopular, cutting spending is unpopular. So they turn to inflation, quietly transferring the cost to citizens who can't easily see it or fight back. The debt gets paid, just not by the people responsible for creating it, and who benefits from this arrangement. The same people who always benefit, those who can protect their wealth from inflation. Those who own real assets, land, businesses, commodities, those who have the resources to hedge against currency devaluation. The wealthy, in other words, find ways to profit from war debt, while ordinary citizens bear the cost. By the early 2000s, this dynamic had become so normalized that most people didn't even notice it anymore. When the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003, there was no serious discussion of raising taxes to pay for the wars. None. In fact, Congress cut taxes for the wealthiest Americans even as the conflicts began. The wars would be paid for entirely through borrowing, and the cost between $4 and $6 trillion once you include long-term medical care for veterans, disability compensation, equipment replacement, and interest on the debt. Let me put that in perspective. The direct spending on the wars totaled around $2.2 trillion by 2019. But the interest payments on the money borrowed to fight those wars will add another $2.1 trillion by 2030. And if the wars had theoretically stopped in 2019, the interest alone would still reach $6.5 trillion by 2050. Think about that for a moment. The interest, the cost of borrowing money to fight these wars, will eventually exceed the cost of fighting them 3 times over. American taxpayers will be paying for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan for generations. Children who were unborn when the war started will be repaying the debt when they enter the workforce, and most of them will never know it. They'll see taxes deducted from their paychecks, see government debt as an abstract number on the news. But they won't connect it to decisions made decades ago by leaders they never elected. This is war by debt in its purest form, invisible, deferred, disconnected from the people who pay for it. And here's the crucial point. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were financed completely differently than any previous American conflict. From the Revolutionary War through the Korean War, the United States paid for its wars primarily through taxation and war bonds. During World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt raised taxes significantly to help cover costs. During the Korean War, President Harry Truman temporarily raised the top tax rate to 92%. During Vietnam, President Lyndon Johnson raised rates to 77%. But when George W. Bush launched the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, taxes went down, not up. Congress cut taxes by roughly 8% for the wealthiest Americans. Every single dollar spent on those wars was borrowed. And most Americans didn't even notice because their taxes didn't go up. They felt no immediate financial pain. The wars simply happened, funded by supplemental appropriations that bypassed normal budget processes, exempt from spending caps, requiring no cuts elsewhere to offset them. Harvard public finance expert Linda Bilmes calls this the ghost budget. The Bush and Obama administrations used an unprecedented combination of borrowing, accounting tricks, and outsourcing to circumvent traditional military budget processes. War costs were kept out of the public debate, oversight was minimal, and the result was trillions spent with little accountability. Massive waste and fraud, corporations raking in huge profits, and the burden shifted onto middle and lower income. Americans through debt rather than distributed fairly through progressive taxation. Research has confirmed what should be obvious. War support drops by about 15% when citizens are directly taxed to pay for conflicts. When people feel the cost in their paychecks, they ask harder questions. They demand better justifications. They hold leaders accountable. But when wars are financed through debt, support stays high because the costs are invisible. People don't connect their economic struggles to decisions made in Washington about foreign interventions. They don't see the line between the national debt and the wars that created it. This creates a profound moral hazard. Leaders can start wars without facing immediate political consequences. They can wage prolonged conflicts without public resistance. They can spend trillions of dollars while citizens remain largely indifferent. The system has been optimized not for wise decision-making, not for careful consideration of whether wars are justified, but for minimizing political friction, for making it easy to say yes to military intervention. And here's where it gets even more troubling, because there's another group that benefits enormously from this arrangement. In 1961, President Dwight Eisenhower delivered his farewell address to the nation. In it, he warned of something he called the military-industrial complex, a powerful alliance between the armed forces, defense contractors, and politicians that could come to dominate national policy. He worried that this complex would create a permanent demand for military spending, regardless of actual security needs. That wars would be perpetuated, not because they served the national interest, but because they served corporate bottom lines. 60 years later, Eisenhower's warning looks prophetic. Between 2001 and 2021, the Pentagon spent over $14 trillion. Roughly half of that, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2, depending on how you count, went to private military contractors. 5 companies alone captured 1/4 to 1/3 of all Pentagon contracts: Lockheed, Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman. In fiscal year 2020, Lockheed Martin received $75 billion in Pentagon contracts. That's more than 1.5 times the entire budget for the State Department. And Agency for International Development combined, Raytheon got $40 billion, General Dynamics got $28 billion, Northrop Grumman got $26 billion, Boeing's Defense Division got $22 billion. These 5 companies took more money in a single year than some countries spend on everything. And here's the mechanism that makes it all work. Defense contractors spend heavily on lobbying and campaign contributions. Over the past 2 decades, weapons makers spent $2.5 billion on lobbying, employing over 700 lobbyists per year on average. That's more than 1 lobbyist for every member of Congress. They donate millions to the campaigns of members of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees, the lawmakers who decide how much money the Pentagon gets each year. And research shows that lawmakers who vote to increase military spending receive 3 times more in campaign contributions from defense contractors than those who vote against increases. The return on investment is staggering. Defense contractors gave $10 million to members of armed services. Committees before votes on the 2023 Pentagon budget, the committees then approved a $45 billion increase beyond what the president requested. That's a return of 4,500 times their investment. And this happens every year. The cycle perpetuates itself. Defense contractors make money from Pentagon spending. They invest a portion of that money into political influence. Politicians approve bigger budgets. Contractors make more money. Around and around it goes. But the key to the whole system, the thing that makes it sustainable, is debt. If the Pentagon budget had to be paid for entirely through taxes, citizens would feel it immediately. There would be pressure to cut spending, to justify every dollar, to explain why we need another aircraft carrier or fighter jet. But when it's financed through borrowing, the costs are diffuse and deferred. The political resistance melts away, and defense contractors thrive. Between 2020 and 2024, 54% of the Pentagon's discretionary spending, about $2.4 trillion out of $4.4 trillion, went to defense contractors. During that same period, twice as much money went to just 5 companies as the United States spent on all diplomacy and international assistance combined. We spent more on Lockheed Martin than on preventing wars through diplomacy. This is the self-reinforcing cycle that debt enables. Wars create contracts, contracts create profits. Profits create lobbying. Lobbying creates more spending. Spending creates more wars. And none of it requires public consent because it's all financed through invisible debt that won't come due for decades. Recent data shows defense contractors are projected to generate $52 billion in free cash flow by 2026, nearly double what they made in 2021. European defense contractors like BAE Systems, Rheinmetall, and SOB expect their cash flows to jump by 40%. Why? Because of conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, because of rising tensions with China. Because the world is, once again, mobilizing for war. And defense contractors are making record profits. The mechanism is elegant in its simplicity. Keep military budgets high, keep conflicts simmering. Ensure there's always a threat on the horizon that justifies more spending. And finance it all through debt, so citizens don't feel the cost until it's too late to object. This brings us to the present day, where the system has reached a kind of terrible perfection. Modern warfare doesn't look like World War II anymore. There's no draft, no rationing, no war bonds sold to citizens, no shared sacrifice. The all-volunteer military is tiny compared to the population. Less than 1% of Americans serve. Most citizens have no direct connection to the wars being fought in their name. No family member deployed. No economic hardship, no disruption to their daily lives. The wars simply happen, somewhere far away, financed by debt they don't see and won't pay off in their lifetimes. Military spending now accounts for roughly 65% of the entire discretionary budget, $726 billion in 2023 alone. And that number keeps climbing even though the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq officially ended. Why? Because the system no longer needs actual wars to justify the spending. The threat of war is enough. The potential for conflict, the need to be prepared. These abstract justifications are sufficient to keep the money flowing because nobody has to pay for it directly. It's all borrowed, all deferred, all pushed onto future generations. And here's the most disturbing implication. War debt doesn't just enable individual conflicts. It transforms war from an emergency measure into a routine policy tool when you can fight without immediate political or economic pain. When you can start conflicts without raising taxes or facing public resistance, when the costs are invisible and the benefits flow to powerful interests, why wouldn't you choose military intervention? Why wouldn't you keep bases in 80 countries, troops in hundreds more, operations running in dozens of locations simultaneously? The debt model has removed the natural constraints that once made war a last resort. It's created a system where the incentives point toward conflict rather than peace, where starting a war is easier than preventing one, where the political path of least resistance leads to intervention rather than restraint. Contemporary research bears this out. Studies show that when citizens experience the direct financial cost of war through taxation, they become significantly less supportive of military intervention. The effect cuts across party lines, across types of conflict, across different countries. People simply care more about wars when they have to pay for them. But when wars are financed through borrowing, support remains high because the costs are abstract and distant. The debt protects political leaders from accountability. It shields them from the consequences of their decisions. This creates a fundamental breakdown in democratic oversight. In a functioning democracy, citizens should have meaningful input into decisions about war and peace. Their representatives should be forced to justify military action, to explain why it's worth the sacrifice, to convince the public that the benefits outweigh the costs. But when those costs are invisible, when they're pushed decades into the future, when they're disconnected from the decision to fight, that accountability disappears. Leaders can wage wars without consequence, without permission, without real debate. And the people who pay are always the same, not the leaders who made the decisions, not the contractors who profited, but ordinary citizens, future taxpayers, workers whose real wages are eroded by inflation, families whose government services are cut to pay interest on old war debt. The bill always comes due. It just never arrives where it should. This is why the story of war debt matters. Not because it's about the past, but because it's about right now. About how we've structured our political system to make war easy and peace difficult. About how we've created incentives that benefit a small elite at the expense of everyone else. About how we've normalized a form of warfare that previous generations would have found morally unconscionable, because here's the ultimate truth: every dollar spent on war debt is a dollar not spent on healthcare, education, infrastructure, research, or any of the countless other investments that actually improve people's lives. Every billion paid in interest is a billion taken from productive use and transferred to bondholders. Every trillion added to the national debt is a trillion-dollar promise that future generations will have to keep, whether they agreed to it or not. War by debt is not just a financial mechanism. It's a way of avoiding accountability, of deferring consequences, of making decisions that benefit the present at the expense of the future. And it works precisely because most people don't understand it, don't see it, don't connect the abstract numbers about national debt to the very real decisions about war and peace that shaped them. But the system may be approaching its limits. Debt can't grow forever. Interest payments can't consume an ever larger share of the budget indefinitely. At some point, the costs become too large to ignore, the burden too heavy to bear. We may be reaching that inflection point now. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan will cost American taxpayers somewhere around $6 trillion when all is said and done. Interest rates are rising, debt service costs are climbing, and there's a growing recognition that the model is unsustainable. The question is, what comes next? Do we return to a system where wars require immediate sacrifice and democratic consent? Do we force leaders to justify military action with taxes rather than hiding it in debt? Do we break the cycle that has made conflict so profitable for so few and so costly for so many? Or do we keep borrowing, keep deferring, keep pushing the costs onto future generations until the entire structure collapses under its own weight? History suggests that when debt reaches its breaking point, war doesn't stop. It just changes form. Currencies collapse, economies convulse, and conflicts erupt not between nations but within them, as citizens finally realize the price they've been forced to pay. The bills eventually come due. They always do. And when they arrive all at once, the cost is far higher than if they'd been paid honestly from the start. This was never about financial sophistication or economic innovation. It was about removing the friction that made war politically difficult, about severing the connection between those who decide to fight and those who pay the price. About creating a system where the people with power benefit from conflict, while the people without power bear the burden. War by debt is the story of how we learned to fight without sacrifice, how we made the most destructive force in human history invisible to the people who fund it, how we built a machine that turns future prosperity into present conflict, that transforms the blood of soldiers and the wealth of nations into profits for a select few. And the machine is still running, still accumulating debt, still financing wars, still postponing the reckoning that must eventually come. The only question is whether we will change the system before it changes us. If you enjoyed this exposition, like the video, share. And if you're interested in understanding more of how the hidden financial machinery of global power really works, how wars are fought in shadows and balance sheets rather than battlefields, consider subscribing. In future videos, we're going to trace how money itself became the battlefield, how economic warfare replaced military conquest, how sanctions and currency manipulation can destroy nations more thoroughly than any army, because the story of war doesn't end with debt. Debt is just the beginning, the foundation upon which an entire empire of financial power was built, and that empire is more powerful, more dangerous, and more unstable than any military force in history. Click the next video for another deep exposition. Thanks for watching.